Ivdu es Hashem b'simcha, serve God with joy. What exactly is joy? What is simcha? One of the most descriptive statements about joy is simcha peiretz geder. Joy breaks the fences, breaks through the fences. We know that when we're in a good mood, when we are joyful, when we are happy, we can do things that we couldn't otherwise do. We become capable. We become freer to do and to accomplish when we are happy. And when we're sad, we become handicapped, we become paralyzed, incapacitated, incapable. But when we say serve God with joy, it could be taken to mean that when you're serving God, when you're doing something special, when you're fulfilling a commandment, when you're observing a holiday, you should do it with joy. So serving God would be doing the mitzvah, and when you're serving God, do it with joy. So the joy seems to be a secondary, an added ingredient to the service of God. The Baal Shem Tov taught that serving God with joy is in itself a mitzvah and a service. It is the joy that serves God. When you are happy, when you are joyful, that is a way of serving God. So even when you're not doing any particular mitzvah, when it's not a holiday and it's not Shabbos, the fact that you are joyful, the fact that you are happy to be in God's world, that serves God. Makes you a very pleasant guest in God's world. A happy guest is a pleasant guest. A miserable guest, a sad guest, is no pleasure to have around. So being happy is itself a form of serving God. Also, when we say serve God with joy, it sounds like a project. Be happy. How? What do you do to be happy? How does one become happy? Now, there are times when, because of our difficulties and because of problems in life, we have to give ourselves reasons to be happy. Be happy that you have what you have. Be happy that you've accomplished what you've accomplished. Be happy to be in the family that you're in. Be happy. Give yourself reasons. But the truth, the natural condition is that joy needs no reason. You don't have to have a reason to be happy. You don't have to have a reason to be joyous. On the contrary, sadness needs a reason. To not be happy needs a cause. Something has to happen that makes you unhappy. Events, problems, difficulties, aches and pains can make you unhappy. But when you have no aches and pains and when you have no problem, what are you then? Then you're happy. Because happy is a symptom of life. Anything that is alive sings, is happy. It's only when things weigh on it, when things obstruct the flow of life, that block is experienced or felt as unhappiness. And that's why we've said before, on other occasions, that sadness is not a feeling. Happiness is a feeling. Sadness is not a feeling. Because sadness means that you are not disposed to feelings. Sadness means you don't have the energy to experience a feeling. So sadness itself certainly can't be called a feeling. So it isn't technically, literally correct to say I feel sad. Because when I'm sad, I don't feel. Except anger. You can always be angry, which must mean that that's also not a real feeling. But that's another subject. To be happy is a natural condition. And we see this in children. You don't have to give children reasons to be happy. They're happy to be alive. They're happy because life is happy. When we annoy them, when we bother them, when we when we abuse them, God forbid, then they learn to be sad. Then they acquire sadness. But you don't have to acquire happiness. Happiness comes natural. Happiness is a condition of life. So how to be happy in a life that isn't perfect, in a world that isn't perfect? All you need to do is get rid of the causes for the sadness. And the result is a natural, genuine, true joy. How do you get rid of the sadness? So the Alter Rebbe writes in Tanya, which was printed for the first time about 200 years ago. The Alter Rebbe writes in Tanya, chapter 26, that to get rid of sadness, so that you can serve God with joy, you need to understand the nature of suffering. When you understand that nothing bad ever happens to a person, then you are able to be happy regardless of what happens in your life. And even if your sadness comes from moral concerns, maybe you're sad and upset and unhappy because you've done bad things, because you've misbehaved, and that's not coming from God, and that is not good. There's no way to rethink that and to redefine that as being good. It's not good. You did bad. And that's what's upsetting you, and that's what's depressing you, and that's why you're unhappy. The Alter Rebbe says there are occasions, there are times when you should set aside, when you have peace of mind, when you can focus, when you can think about who it is you sinned against. When you think about God's goodness, and in contrast to His goodness, you think about what you've done against His will, then you're experiencing a true regret, and then the relationship becomes better. But if you don't have the time to think about who you sinned against, and you're depressed and saddened simply by the act of the sin or the fact of the sin, this is not a genuine tshuva, this is not a genuine regret, this is simply being dragged down into unhappiness without justification. So if a person is sad about sins, set aside a time. Pick a time, next week, Thursday night, the first day of the last day of the month, or the last day of the week, or the last hour of the night before you go to sleep. Set aside that time to really focus on your relationship with God and make it better. And once you make it better, you have no reason to be sad anymore. So to walk around sad for extended periods of time because you did something wrong and because you've sinned is not genuine, it's not helpful, it's not tshuva, it doesn't bring you closer to God. You're just wallowing in sadness, and it's not justified. Even if a person feels sad, not because of something he did, but simply because of who he is. He just doesn't like himself. He's got nasty character traits. He's got an unholy frame of mind. His thoughts are not innocent. His personality needs improvement, and whose doesn't. And that's what he's upset about. He's unhappy with himself, not with his sins, and not with his fate, just himself. And even here the Alter Rebbe says, this is not genuine. This is not productive. This is not justified. God created us this way. He created us with many things that need improvement. He created us with weaknesses, with imperfections, and it's our job to perfect those things. So of course we're going to notice our own imperfections. But that's not a reason to be discouraged in life. That's what life is about. That's how we serve God, by turning the bitter into sweet and the darkness into light. So there is no reason to be discouraged, disheartened, or sad. So what we see from all of this is that joy is a natural condition. We would be happy if we didn't give ourselves reasons and excuses for being sad. When we eliminate those reasons, we eliminate those thoughts, then we are naturally innocently, happy and joyous. The statement that joy breaks through the fences has a deeper meaning beyond inspiring you to greater activity. We learn in Kabbalah that every divine attribute somehow expresses itself into the physical world, into the physical universe. God's kindness is expressed in worldly kindness. When the rains come on time, that's God's kindness. Divine kindness expressed in physical ways. Divine judgment, of course, is expressed in physical ways. Divine compassion, divine wisdom. Every one of the 10 attributes that are involved in creation find expression in the physical. They come into the physical through the gate of kindness, the gates of wisdom, the gates of judgment. Each one of the attributes has a gate. So although it's a divine attribute, which is really infinite by nature, heavenly by nature, how does it come to express itself into the physical? It is separated from the physical by a fence or a wall. Yet it finds a way to reach the physical. It finds a way of expressing itself in the physical, because in that wall that separates the divine from the created, there is a gate. And through that gate, the infinite divine comes down into the finite earthly. And that's why we find in the Kabbalah constant references to the gates of kindness, the gates of justice, the gates of mercy. In addition to the 10 divine attributes that are associated with creation, directly or indirectly, there are two other divine attributes that transcend creation completely. And they are known as the crown that sits above the head, above wisdom, above intellect. In this crown, there's an inside and an outside, the internal and the external. The external part of the crown is called will. In addition to God's wisdom, in addition to God's attributes of kindness, severity, judgment, compassion, so on, there is an overriding will that precedes all of it. Because one is not wise unless you want to be. One doesn't think unless you want to think. One is not kind unless you want to be kind. So there's a will that drives all 10 attributes and is greater than all 10 of them. It's an all-encompassing attribute. The will is everywhere. We're created in God's image, and we see this in ourselves as well. Will exists everywhere. Intellect is in the mind, emotions are in the heart, activity is in the feet and hands. Where is the will? Where does our will reside? Not in any one particular organ. It resides everywhere. It's present everywhere. And that's why when you want to move your foot, it moves instantaneously. It doesn't have to go through some process from mind to heart to foot. Will is in the foot already, and therefore it reacts instantly to your will. Not the same as intelligence. When you want to transfer intelligence to your foot, which means you want to learn to dance, it takes time. To train your feet to move in a pattern, in a logical sequence, that takes time, because intelligence doesn't naturally reside in the feet. It resides in the head. And to move it from the mind to the foot takes great effort. But will doesn't take any time at all, because it takes no effort at all. When you want to move your foot, it moves. So the will is present everywhere. And the same is true with the divine attributes. God's will is present everywhere. And so in that sense, it's not really an attribute like the others. The others are individual attributes, and will is a general, encompassing attribute. It's everywhere within the other attributes. But that's the outside, the external part of the crown. The internal part of the crown is called pleasure. Because even will needs motivation. The will motivates all 10 attributes. Our will is what motivates us to know, to understand, to think, to feel. But what motivates the will? We want, but why do we want? What makes us want? So the internal, that which is within the will, that drives the will, is called pleasure. Divine pleasure. Because there is a pleasure to whatever activity it is that we're going to do, there's a pleasure in understanding and in knowing. There's a pleasure in being kind and sharing kindness, and there's a pleasure in disciplining ourselves and being correct in what we do. The pleasure behind that creates a will for it. Because I see pleasure in it, I want it. And when I want it, that activates, motivates the behavior, the specific attribute. The crown, the two attributes of will and pleasure, are greater than the creation itself, and therefore cannot be encompassed in creation. In very simple terms, every part of the soul, which is a piece of God and has the same attributes as God, every part of the soul has a gate through which it expresses itself into the body, so that the physical body can enjoy the pleasure of being kind, of loving. The physical body can enjoy the pleasure of discovering a new idea, of really understanding something thoroughly, of grasping a concept. That enjoyment, that experience, through its gate, affects even the physical body. But the pleasure of the soul is so soulful, it is so much part of the soul, that the soul cannot express it outwardly. It's the nature of pleasure that it can't be shared. One cannot feel the other's pleasure, because pleasure is so close to who I am that it's strictly for me. And the first impulse, the first stirrings within me that involves another person, that can reach out to another person, is will. Will is outer directed. That's why it's the external part of the crown. But pleasure is internal. It's about me, it's for me, it is me. And therefore, there is no gate. Pleasure has no gate. The pleasure of the soul is not available to the body. That's why we need joy. Joy breaks the fence. That fence that separates pleasure, the pleasure of the soul, from the physical, from the body, where there is no gate, you have to break through that wall and create an opening where there isn't one. How do we do that? What breaks through that wall? What makes pleasure available to the body? Joy. That's the deeper meaning of joy breaks the fence. The fence that has no gate, the fence that is completely sealed off by its very nature. Pleasure of the soul is not available to the body. Even that can become available through joy. In very, very simple terms, in very practical terms, we know, for example, that when a person is sad, they tend to eat more. When we're in a bad mood, we indulge in pleasures. We seek to pacify and fill the negative feeling, the empty feeling, with pleasure. So when we're not happy, we eat. We indulge in a pleasure. But we also know that eating when you're not happy is unhealthy. It can't be good for the body. Because when you're eating, having pleasure, but without joy, then you haven't broken through that wall, through that fence that keeps pleasure of the soul away from the body, so that the pleasure that you're having in the food is strictly a body pleasure, not the soul pleasure. And body pleasure is not real, because a body is a lifeless thing, essentially, without the soul. So a physical pleasure is not the real thing. It's not real pleasure. And therefore, when you eat and have pleasure from the food without joy, then that pleasure carries none of the soul's pleasure. It is strictly the body pleasure, and body pleasure is unhealthy to the body. Pleasure without joy is a lifeless pleasure, an unhealthy pleasure. We're told, for example, that on holidays, in the festival times, when we are happy, then we should celebrate by eating. See, now it makes a lot of sense. You can eat and enjoy the pleasure of the food without harming yourself, without it being unhealthy, because we assume that on a festival, on a festive day, you are happy. And when you're happy, the food won't be unhealthy. My mother always told me that. If you're miserable at the table, then the food won't be healthy. I never understood what that meant. I don't know how I made the food sick. But it wasn't that I made the food sick. It was that the food will make me sick if I eat it without joy. Because when you take pleasure without the accompanying joy, then it's a lifeless pleasure. The soul's pleasure is not present, is not available, it's not participating. And so it's a pleasure that drags us down rather than lifts us up. In many ways, in our society, we have become a pleasure-seeking society without joy. We have so many pleasures available to us, but we don't have the accompanying joy. And as a result, all the pleasures we indulge in are not doing the trick. They're not making us healthier. They're not making us happier, because pleasure doesn't make you happy. You need happiness to experience pleasure. The happiness breaks that barrier, breaks down that wall that says soul's pleasure is for souls and body's pleasure is for bodies. We break that separation, we break that wall, and the soul's pleasure becomes present and is expressed in physical activity. So that in the physical pleasure there's also a soul pleasure. And when that happens, then the pleasure is uplifting, then it is enlightening, then it is healthy, then it serves us better. So how important is it to be happy? If the essence of life, if the deepest stirrings of the soul is pleasure, then without pleasure, we are without life. Now obviously, sadness and depression are lifeless in and of themselves. Person is happy, he's animated, he's alive. Person is sad, depressed, dejected, he's lifeless, he's dull. Even looks dull. But that's not the whole story. What's even worse is that where there is no pleasure, where there is no joy, there is certainly no pleasure. And where there is no pleasure, you have a truly lifeless condition. Because the essence of life is pleasure. In fact, all of the attributes that we have all of the various expressions of life that we have are really different disguises and different shapes and forms that pleasure takes on. So, for example, we are capable of activity, physical activity. What makes us capable of that activity? Because it contains pleasure. Pleasure expressing itself in the movement of the body. Why do we enjoy speaking? Why are we capable of speaking? Because there's a pleasure in speech. Why are we capable of thinking? Why do we bother to think? Because there's a pleasure to thinking. So in a sense, all activity, all emotion, all experience are various shapes and forms of pleasure. Because pleasure essentially is a definition of life. Where there is no joy, where we have not broken the fence, the gate that separates the pleasure of the soul from the physical body, then we are without life because we are without pleasure. In our desperation, we try to replace it, to compensate, by introducing physical pleasure, the pleasures that always are available, easily attainable. And we hope that that will bring us alive, will give us life. But it doesn't work. Number one, because the pleasure of the body, the physical pleasure that is so easily available, is not the real thing. It's not the pleasure of the soul. And the pleasure of the soul is simply not available because when you're unhappy, you've locked it away. You can still function. Other parts of the soul are still being expressed, but that's because they have gates. And through those gates, the life of the soul flows to the body. But pleasure has no gate. You have to create the gate. You have to gain access to that pleasure. And the only way to get to that pleasure is through joy. Because joy breaks the barriers and brings the full strength of the soul with its pleasure, with its crown, into the world, into the body, so that we become truly alive.
We have a Sunday night program for VIPs that you might be interested in. It's informal, it's questions and answers, it's conversation. It's really relaxed, it's really pleasant, enjoyable, informative, and kind of community-like. It's a Sunday night program. There's a Wednesday morning program for the VIPs, and there's a Wednesday night program. All of it just conversation, casual, laid back, unscripted. So join us, take a look, click the link below, and see which of the three suits you best, and join us for some enjoyable conversation.